Jazzy, Shakopee's in the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s. But I say that, but reality is we're really talking about prohibition for the most part in this
sit right in front of you so you can't see.
All right. It's interesting because Shakopee did have some progress in starting in the 1920s. They had the first female mayor, Elizabeth Rice, in 1925. Reese, and she did it again in 1927. Now, does anybody know what other mayors have been women?
Marge Henderson.
Marge Henderson, I don't think she did. She ever?
I don't know if she was mayor.
She tried, but I don't think she did it.
No, she's never there.
But there's one more.
Halver.
Yeah, who?
Halver, or Halverson, or something like that.
I think that's the one. There's one other woman,
Yes.
I think that's, otherwise they've been all men, so.
Yeah.
But anyway, it started in the 20s. Also, it's interesting because Shakopee Street Bridge was completed, linking Shakopee to Chaska. That was in 1927.
Was that located on 41 or on 101?
That's the one that's going toward, yeah, 101. It is what's now is the Home Street Bridge. It's still there. It's now a walk, you can walk across it now. It's not the main one, but it's still there. And it's an interesting, I found it really interesting because Mona Rose Strunk actually had pictures that showed this while it was done. Yes.
I think the original bridge is where the current bridge is now. The
Yes.
second bridge is what's.
The original bridge started in 1880, and that was on Lewis Street, and that was the swing bridge. That was there. That was the first one that was across the river. That was a huge problem at that time because at that time they wanted to have a river crossing because they were doing ferries before then. There were 3 ferries in the area. And it's interesting because at some point they decided they looked and decided they were going to do a bridge. They put it in to do it, and the mayor of Shakopee at that time did not want the bridge to be any place except on Lewis Street because his business was on Lewis Street and he wanted to come in and see his business. And so they would go back and forth, and there were lots of articles in the paper about this. Eventually, and he turned, they vote on it, and they'd say yes, and then he would turn it down over and over until finally they did it on Lewis Street. When they did that, the people in the town were really mad at the mayor, and so they stopped going to his business. And so he ended up leaving the town after being there for about 30 years. So it's just kind of interesting how that process.
What was his business?
He was a merchandise that is now continued. It's been in 5 other places around still. But I have to think of his name. It's not coming out of my head, so.
It wasn't Holmes?
What?
It wasn't Thomas Holmes?
No.
Dave, the bridge that was,
I have to, it'll come to me in a little bit.
that's been resurrected to make it look like new there. The street bridge, what do you call that? Is that the $5 million bid going nowhere? Is that the one we're talking?
Just wait, I gotta see what you're talking.
The bridge has been abandoned, it used to be used.
The home, which is Home Street.
That was rehabbed, it's rusting as we speak.
Okay, that's the Home Street Bridge, and that is historic because of that.
Yeah.
Before then, the one that was before then, the Swing Bridge, was there and became a walking place afterwards. But eventually they took it apart for the war effort, and they gave that, because there was lots of steel there that was used for the thing. All right. So here are the people working on the Home Street Bridge. And it's just kind of interesting to see, you know, some of those pictures of that, I think.
Those are pictures I've never seen.
Yeah, I know. Me either. And that's what it is now. Also, something interesting about Shakopee in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there was that big bank robbery here in Shakopee. That was a big thing at that time. And that was in 1929. Remember that the bank was on the north side of First Avenue. And it was right next to Strong Drugs, right next to it there. And what was interesting is that Charles Mange was, he was a world, well, I mean, he was in the Civil War and so on. He never actually drove a car. He always was with a horse and buggy. He would bring his kids, our grandkids, to school, to St. Mary's on this buggy kind of thing. But anyway, and then he would go downtown. So he was heading downtown, and then he heard that a robbery was happening. So he started yelling out, "Get your guns, the bank is being robbed." And he yelled it out, and all these people downtown all brought guns and came there. They stopped the robbery. So it worked.
Wasn't he in the, part of the Faribault family?
Yes, he is. Yeah, he's the wife of the daughter of the, and so because of that, he was on, they had a parade with him as the, what do you call it, the first person? Grand Marshal, because of that. Okay. We also know that, for example, Bill's Toggery was started in 1931. Remember this, we're now the third generation of the Bills, right? So just so you know that. But the first one started, it was actually on Home Street. It was actually where the printing shop is now, okay? And that used to be, before then, it was also a laundry place by, there was a Chinese-American person who had a laundry there. We don't have a picture, unfortunately, of that thing, but we do know that that did happen. Then Bill ended up taking it. He was there for about a year and a half, 2 years. Then he moved to Lewis Street, where he is now, and been there since. Okay. And also, it's also interesting because on that corner there, that used to be the People Bank. And it used to be that, what was that?
Charles Lindbergh Sr.?
Charles Lindbergh Sr. was one of the members of that bank. And they actually, his child, who was an adult at that time, borrowed $1,000 to build a plane. He only paid back $100. So technically it should not be the spirit of St. Louis, it should be Shakopee. We paid for it. All right. All right.
It is.
So it's just interesting stories about the past and why it's so interesting, because there is like tie-ins to a lot of interesting things. Okay, and another thing, of course, Rara Malting was built in 1836, and it's still in business. It expands more and more, and now I think it does about 90, maybe more than 90% of all malt in the United States is coming from here.
The world's largest single malt
Yeah.
facility.
It's the world's largest.
Yeah. The world, yeah. So that's good. But it's interesting because remember, by the end of the 1930s, there's only about 2,416 people who actually lived in Shakopee. However, they also had at least 27 bars. So, this is the thing. The 18th Amendment made it illegal to sell, make, or transport liquor, alcohol. It's also interesting because the same thing happened in Canada. They last for 2 years. Ours lasts for, I think, 18 or something. So, but it was actually a person from Minnesota who actually wrote the regulations and the reinforcement. But, and this is what someone said, this is one of when we did our interviews, he said Shakopee was what was called a wide open town. And what that meant is that even though they're not supposed to, they still were selling alcohol. And actually pretty much anything, I think, was pretty much open. The gambling, all that kind of stuff was happening in Shakopee, even though technically they weren't supposed to.
My dad lived in South Minneapolis, and he used to call this Little Chicago.
Yeah, see, exactly. We've had the same thing. I think I have something. We know, oh yeah, Prohibition was here for 13 years. And we knew that in the Twin Cities, there were crooks, you know, and stuff. There were gangsters, bank robberies. That's why, of course, we had that here. Bootleggers, okay. And because they could come here, this was the place that they would come. So when they were there, they would come here and do a lot of their stuff because it was a wide open town. In other words, the police would not stop them from doing that. And it was a lot of under the table kind of stuff. And here's an example of what you just mentioned. So Betty Dole, she said she was 15 years old, and she was going to Bobble's store here in Shakopee to buy a ticket on the Greyhound to go to Watertown, South Dakota. And she sat next to somebody who asked where she lived. And Betty said, "Oh, I'm from Shakopee." And he said, "Oh, you lived in Little Chicago." And you're right, just like you said. And that really was the way it was. Every bar, every barber shop, every gas station had slot machines. And bars were supposed to sell 3.2 beer, but other liquor was sold illegally.
Can you even find 3.2 beer anyplace now?
Grocery stores, I was just gonna say that's probably. And they said that it's because people had the local police and politicians deep in their back pockets. So they would, give them money in order to let them have that happen.
Wasn't local police, it was a county sheriff.
County sheriff.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you're right about that. Okay. As Hillary said, he said, you keep law and order as long as you don't cause trouble. That was kind of the rule. And the under the table agreement was with stamps, which I thought was really, I've never heard that. He said they use that instead of, like for letters, that's how they pay them, by giving them stamps that must have had like books and stamps. No, I've never heard that before, but he said that was very much clear. We talked a little more about it, so that's his view of that, okay. And I know that Richard Murs said at one point that every time the state liquor control officers came into the county, phones would ring at all of the 3-2 bars, warning bartenders of a possible raid. They let them know, they pass it along all the way through to all 27 bars. They would all know, so that by the time they actually got there, everything was fine. 3-2 beer, hopefully, okay. So here's a good example of what happened. There was a feisty Irishman. They called him, he told him that there was the liquor thing was coming, right? So they knew that was coming. So he said, then they went, 2 men dressed in suit arrived and came into the booth. So right away, your first thing right away you have to say is, that's not Shakopee, so there's something going on, right? Because most people don't wear suits on Saturday. So that was a good giveaway. Plus they sat in a booth. And at that time, only people who had a girl, like a wife or a girlfriend, would sit in the booth, except for the Liquor Control Agency. So then, of course, the agent, one of them ordered charged water and the other ginger ale. And Mac, who was the bartender, went behind the bar and returned with the drinks and rang up the register. And they tried to drink, they drank it, and they said, "Hey, there's no liquor in here." And which was strange, because that's normally what happened. And he said it was the policy of the house not to serve liquor to liquor control agents. And of course they said everybody started laughing, of course, and they of course laughed quickly without drinking the beer. So that's a good memory of people, what they responded related to what it was like at that time. It's also interesting, the whiskey sixes is another thing that pops up a lot. That, they have these big cars that would be whizzed down the border town. Remember in Canada, it only was for 2 years that they had prohibition. So we knew that in Canada, they had the beer or the liquor. So people would go from here to Canada, get all the liquor, and drive it back down here, okay? And so the cars were actually called whiskey sixes. So they need to have a really good car that has 6 cylinders and they were best, and that's why they called them the Whiskey Sixes. And it's also interesting because those cars often would have secret panels or something, or in the gas tank and stuff, where they could hold the booze in order to use that. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about the process that people did. And so here's a good example of what a Whiskey Six looks like. In Shakopee, the Whiskey Sixes were often the milk trucks here in Shakopee. And the person who was the milk person made a lot of money. I'm not saying the name here, okay, but I do know that it's from because they had trucks, and they could go to Canada and back, and they would work out because it looked like they were just milk trucks, right? But actually that's how they brought it in and out. And they said in terms of the Whiskey Sixes that they tend to be in three would be together, three cars, okay? The first one would have no liquor, and then there would be two behind it. And he'd drive until he'd see that there was no liquor officers there, and then he'd let them know, and then they would come through, and then he'd bring it in. And this just made me laugh when I saw this sign. And you know, it wasn't necessarily even just beer, but it was a lot of their alcohol. And you talk about in Shakopee, there was what people called a bathtub gin. You know, and people would actually make their own gin in a bathtub. And that's why it was called bathtub thing. And this then also just was, I was reading through the thing, this just makes me laugh because I remember this song. Papa's in the shed mixing up the mash. Junior's in the parlor counting out the cash. Mama's in the kitchen washing out the mugs. Sister's in the pantry filling up the jugs. And so we knew that, and that is true, that in Shakopee as well as all over, there are a lot of people would have their bootlegging happening, and they would actually have just outside of the town, but they would actually have places where they would do that. One that we often talk about, and I think it's kind of interesting, is the Rock Spring Cafe on Lewis Street. Now it's where we actually had our event that we had recently, right? The same place. But back then, it was interesting because you would walk into, or you'd go by that place, and there were nice cars parking all along that street, right? Now, most people in Shakopee did not have those nice cars. So you knew it was kind of interesting by that. Then if you looked in the window, you see that there would be like nobody there. Or maybe just like one person there, which usually was a bouncer. So it didn't make sense because they had these great cars, really fancy cars, but you look inside, there's nobody there. They were all in the basement, because in the basement was where the slot machines were, where the gambling, where the drinking was happening. And they had a person who was guarding it. And for the most part, they didn't allow people in Shakopee in to go down there. It was really for the people from the Twin Cities. The people who had the most money probably, and you know, they did that. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. So again, this is what I say about, you know, here we have Fords and Chevrolets, but in front they were really fancy ones. And again, they really picked those from the Twin Cities who had probably the money, and that's what they used in this process. The other thing that's really interesting is because we knew that they would come around every once in a while to find out if they actually had liquor. They used to have runners who would inform when a raid was coming. And they had safe houses. There's one on Spencer Street right across from St. Mary's School, which is now the Henderson, right? And that was a safe house where they knew, when they knew that it was coming, they would gather up those things, put it into a truck, drive it up there, hide them in this house until the liquor thing went away a day or two, and then he brought it back.
Okay, which house
Um,
across from there?
This one says that, but I believe it's the one, if you look on Spencer Street and where the school, or Henderson is now.
Yeah.
I think it's probably the last one on the, all the way down, but I'm not sure. Because on Spencer and Fifth Street,
Yeah,
that one right there.
Spencer or Somerville?
Spencer, sorry. Oh, Somerville, yeah.
Yeah, that is Somerville.
Well, I'll have to check this one out with the thing, because I got to find out from the person who told me this. But I think it actually is Somerville. Maybe that might be wrong on my thing,
okay.
probably. I think it actually is. But they do know that there were probably 30 or 40 safe houses in Shakopee. I know that, like one of the sheriffs, his son, I think, no, or his father probably, had a barn, and that they, use the same thing. So we know that it was happening a lot.
Steve,
Yeah.
on the basement of blocks 3 and 4, the old part, when they started taking it down, you could see the doors leading from one
Wait, coming up
whole
later.
unit. Oh, sorry.
All right. So Joe Jen, who used to be a janitor at the school, he said Shakopee was really a community by itself, cut off from the Minnesota River and the river bottoms. And that's true until they got the 169 in, we were pretty much set from the rest of the cities. He said back in the 1930s, the town was a little Las Vegas, so same thing with the thing we said before, right? He says there were 33 beer joints at one time, and notorious nightclubs like Rock Springs and the Riviera. And he said people, including gangsters, would come here for booze, women, and gambling. The mayor, the sheriff, and the city council members, I think at that time, were all along with it. Then finally, when Luther became governor, they told him they had to clean up the town. Okay, so before then it was pretty much gone, but even afterwards it continued for quite a
It
while.
had to be in the early 40s.
Yeah.
Was it Luther Youngdahl, brother-in-law, one of the priests out here in Shakopee?
I don't know that that's possible, because I know there is a connection between there, if I remember. I have read something about that, I'll have to find more. And here again, he's saying, there was a garage that was established on Lewis Street. And the rear door of the alley was the receiving deposit for boxes of liquor. And according to Joe Jensen, said there was also bottling works in town, Rock Spring, right? And they used to bring bottles of pop to St. Paul and return with bottles of whiskey.
All right.
So, now again, this is again a person is saying this, so I can't say it's true or not, but I think it probably is, my understanding. So. Right, exactly. You work both ways that way, so exactly, it makes sense. So, and there's the Rock Springs people there, so. Another really interesting place is the Pullman Club, which is still there in downtown Shakopee. And Hillary, that when we interviewed him, he said that his mother was a bouncer there, and his mother was a waitress in the Pullman Club. And he said that he knew that in the way back there was a room with 4 rows of one-eyed Band-Aids, was just, the slot machine. And he was 6 years old, and he remembers going and asking for money. And he went to his slot machine, he put in a nickel, he pulled the arm, and out came about $5 of nickels. Now he was 6 years old. And he said he remembers he looked at his mom, and his mom said, "You can have it." So that's why he remembered it from now he's in his 80s, and he's remembering that because it's something he really remembered he got $5 worth of nickels because of that. So
I was pretty put on.
now technically, I don't think that was allowed by law, I'm sure, but anyway.
Well, not much was.
Right, but not much was at that time, right? The Riviera Club was a club from 1938 until 1952. And it's by Riverside Park, you know where that is, okay? Which is, if you go down over the river on Lewis Street, on the left side is where used to be Riverside Park, where is the baseball field. And in that also was what used to be the county fair area, which then became Riverside, Riviera, okay? And it was another speakeasy here in Shakopee. This one picture, just so you know, is when it was burnt down. So that's why this picture has that with that. This one was burnt down. They said it took a little over an hour for it to be burnt down. And they think it was probably happening, why it burnt down was because of the damaged wire from the recent floods. And that was, of course, the problem with Riverside Park anyway, and still is really, is that the water at some point, some years, the water would go up, you know, take everything from there. But again, we do know that Shakopee were involved with bootlegging. I'm not saying specific people, but there are a few you can kind of know. If you know a few, you can find out who's who, or remember that. Here's one person who said, she said, my father ran this place, a bar, that was a booze peddler. She said, I was a little girl during Prohibition when my mother sent me down a few times with a little grape basket with a bottle in it, covered with a napkin. So she came in, she said, this was Elizabeth Schultz, she said, so then I came in to bring it, and the feds came. And he threw the glass on the floor, but there remains enough evidence in the glass to take him away. And he'd end up being in jail for a few months. I know my great uncle, I should say, maybe his great uncle in Stearns County had a very similar thing. He ended up being in prison for a year, I think. So, you know, it happens, I guess. Another one that's really interesting is the Mill Pond Club in Shakopee. You know where that's located, or was located?
Dangerfield.
Where Dangerfield is now, yeah. Oops. All right, there, okay. They say that it was probably the largest gambling place in Shakopee and the largest casino also there. Now, I believe that's probably true, but we do know that almost everything that you found in Las Vegas was here at the Mill Pond. There's cars, there's drinks, there's slot machines, and almost everything else there. And we do know that. And again, the cars on the weekends, all these parks, you know, all these cars were there. There's actually, at that point, the Mill Pond was here. Here's the First Avenue, okay, which is 101. There used to be a little house right by there. It's not there anymore. It's a white house there. And that was a safe house. And they had little gun portals in it because it'd sit watch for if anything happened. And that was true. And they know that at one evening, bandits with Tommy guns robbed the Mill Pond and their customers and the workers during regular business hours. And again, when these people come with guns, they're walking in, normally the police would be called. But of course, because there's agreement that says leave them alone, they didn't show up in this situation. And because of that, the customers and the workers said they didn't want to come back to the mill pond to work. Because who would after you have somebody with guns coming in and taking all your stuff, okay? And so the mill pond decided, responded by adding a bulletproof enclosure containing an armed guard with a shotgun at the center of the gambling room to protect them all. And that is true. And if you actually go to the place now, ask them about that stuff. They can actually show a little bit of what things were there at that time. So, I mean, I always ask because I figure, what the heck. Someone there will know, I'm sure. It's also interesting because here's just another view of this. Remember, this was the mill pond, but right across the street was where the Faribault family lived. Okay, and then there was the Faribault pond here, and then there was the pond family here. So the Faribault family, they were part Dakota Indian. And Charles Mangy and his wife were there. Charles was part Ho-Chunk Indians, and Eliza was part Dakota. And they were not very happy because of the gambling that was going across the street. And this is actually a picture of Charles at that point. And he said, you see that big house over there, building over there, he said. This is his granddaughter said this, he said. He said that his father tried to put a fence up, but the people kept breaking it down each time he put it up. So he went to the village authorities here in Shakopee. He said, you know, I have my grandchildren are here, kids, you know, but they said they wouldn't do anything, okay? He said, that is a tavern, and at night it gets very noisy, and the people come outside and make a nuisance of themselves. People used to come over to my land and lie in the grass. They broke bottles against our trees and threw things at our house. They called us Indians, and they were, okay, because they had Indian blood. So the child finally decided, he said, so I will take the law in my own hands. I'm not going to have those drunken bums lying on my green grass. I'm not going to have those drunken bums leaning against my beautiful trees. I'm not going to have them polluting the pure water of our creek. They are going to leave off our property. And so he used to sit under a tree with a shotgun, and he threatened anyone who came near the tavern side of the property. And that story had been passed on from generation to generation that this is what happened. And apparently it worked. Now another interesting one that we heard is, remember we have the mill pond, but right next to it used to be this house. And that house is what they said was the biggest gambling house around. And Marilyn Lang remembered this. She remembers that her father, Bill Ladisau, and his wife, and 4 children, including the last one, which was Maryland, moved to Shakopee, and this was in 1942. At the time, Bill and this other person, Maynard Bullock, worked at the National Youth Association camp. You know where that was? What is now in the landing area, okay? And for years, that was a place for people who needed help. They learned how to do trades and stuff so they could go off into the world. It's a very interesting story by itself. But they know that Bill and his wife and her kids, including Marilyn, remember that they couldn't find a house at that time here in Shakopee that they could afford. But Bill saw that there was a vacant house on the mill pond, and that was the one that was right in front there. It's not there anymore. So he asked this person at a bar in town called the Hole in the Wall. And finally they said, yes, you can move in. And so they moved in, and Marilyn was 7 years old at this time. And she remembered, she said, don't think there was a slot machine in the ice cream parlor in Shakopee, but I think every place else had a slot machine, including at the gas station. And the building that they were in, this house, they said the bar was still connected. You could still pull the spigot and the beer flowed. The whiskeys cabinet behind the bar was still filled with whiskey. It was clearly not a house designed for a family. And she said she remembered there was a place where there were holes drilled through the house where you could put a rifle or a gun. And that was because this building, and this is what it looked like, which was right in front of the mill pond, was really a gambling house. And she also remembered they told him that they couldn't change anything because they were hoping that they could open the house again and continue. So even the toilets and the urinal that were bad because they hadn't been used. There was no water running there, and she said it was really bad. She said when you walked in, even after just coming in, it's been there, no one's been there, it was still, the smoke was really bad. And she remembers her mother took a pail of water and soap and a brush, and she'd washed an area about 2 feet square, and then she'd have to change the water. It was just so much smoke. And she cried. And again, a memory that someone remembers and can remember and pass along, but it makes it interesting about the whole thing. Another interesting place, here's the Ellie Cat bar, but it's just interesting because you see in this photo, on the left side are actually slot machines right there. And so that's how you see how clearly it was there everywhere. And another place that's kind of interesting, the Shesho brothers was across from the police station on 2nd Street in Lewis. And there were 2 kids that were there, and they were sitting there, and suddenly a big black sedan pulls out. 2 men get out of the car with their guns drawn. This is right across from the police station, right? And they march these 2 kids out of the street with their guns still drawn and into the car. They drove the 2 boys out of town, and they had to tell them what happened. And they knew because the 2 boys had found some moonshine. And when they found out where it was, they took it, these kids, because they were going to sell it, and they sold it to other people for money. So they made some good money, these kids did. But once they figured this out, the 2 people who had the guns decided to leave the kids alone. They didn't kill them because they were young. They scared them, they let them go. They told them not to do it again. And then the men went back to town. They went to each of the bootleggers in town who had been using the moonshine and took them back. And they made piles of all the whiskey in a secret place, then came back and picked it up later. So just an interesting story. And Pat Thielen was the police officer at that time, said there was just no police interference during any of this time. That was the way it was. Now we'll talk about the machine room at the Pullman Club Cafe. They said if you walked in, and you still can walk in now because it's still there, you went all the way back near the restrooms, and across from the restroom was a room full of slot machines. The kids in Shakopee used to call this the machine room. And there was no lock on the door. There was no guard watching. It was kind of open for anybody. So it was perfect for teenagers who were looking for a little bit of money. So they would check around first and see if there's any money on the ground or in the slot machine. And then they'd play the machines with it until they found the one that's broken. And then that one you can actually continue to play without having to pay for it. And so they just sit and go back and forth like this over and over until they get all the money, and they gathered it all up and they took off, okay? And this is really a very common thing for teenagers. This is kind of what they did. That's how they made their money, I guess. All right. And they said that once they did it, they brought it all together afterwards, and then they split it up, and they all got it. And they said they never actually used the money to go back and do more machine. No, it was just to get the money to have the money.
Dave, there was a period of time that Pullman got caught for getting electricity bypassing the meter.
I don't know. Yeah, it's probably true. Possibility. At one point, then, of course, they had the deputy sheriff, Wilmer Skirschen, was appointed as acting sheriff. And the slot machines disappeared. But over time, they still came back. And there's actually the Saturday Evening Post, they actually talked about Shakopee in 1947. They said they would talk about the place here in Shakopee, said, where residents of Minneapolis and St. Paul used to go for their Sunday cocktails, which they couldn't buy at home, and to dine in one of our several restaurants that featured thick steaks and slot machines. And here's when they were taking rid of some of the things, there's pictures of them when they were actually grabbing the slot machines. Supposedly destroying, but there are still several around. Some people say a lot of the slot machines were put into the river, and then later people even went into the river to get some of them, and the whole thing. So I just, it's not that enough. But we do know that by 1951, which is really 18 years after the end of Prohibition, Shakopee's reputation as Little Chicago finally came to an end. So it was quite a bit of a time. And the one last thing that I think is really interesting, were there tunnels in downtown Shakopee? Yes, there were. And in fact, when they tore down the north side of First Avenue, there were tunnels underneath there, okay? There are still tunnels, okay? Tunnels were built in downtown Shakopee to connect to the river. It was not for Prohibition. It was even before then, and it was used for water in case of a fire. At that time, before there was a fire department, there was really concern because we had a lot of fires that happened and would destroy, at that time when they didn't have a lot of brick yet, and they were doing regular timber, they would burn down. So exactly on Home Street, the west side of Home Street, for example, which is now is where Babes is and other buildings, that whole block was burnt down because of a fire. And it was heading towards this way, and at that time, of course, we didn't really have enough. We were trying to get the water. There was a problem with that. They ended up calling St. Paul. They had to take a train in to help with, so the whole process was really an awful thing. And so I think when they were building the newer, or the buildings in the 1880s, 1890s, they made sure that they would have these tunnels. Yes?
Yeah, there was actually cisterns in the street.
Yeah.
So they filled with water so the fire department could pump out of the cisterns. Yeah. And I suppose eventually they just piped it back to the river.
Into the river, yeah. Exactly, that's correct. So then the question come back, and this ties into here. So were they used in Prohibition? I don't have a person to tell me yes or no. That's the only problem. However, the rumor is yes. especially on the north side of First Avenue, and there were a lot of bars there. In those bars, they had tunnels that went out to the river, okay, from there. And so, and then you could go from there from a boat and take that and go away. So technically, we know that they were there, the places. We know that they could probably take the booze from the bar to the boats and take them away to secret location. We do know that, but we just don't know. We don't have. Normally, we want to find evidence. Follow up with someone actually saying so. We don't have that at this point. There are still a few older people who may remember, and so we keep asking. Of course, some people don't want to tell the story either.
There is one slot machine. Okay.
Okay, well, I'll come back to that in a second. So the first thing, are the tunnels still here in Shakopee? Remember, the north side here isn't now, because that's now the apartments and the store, but they don't have the tunnels before. But there are some on the south side of First Avenue, and a few other places too. So I'll give you a good example. For the Journey is down on First Avenue. You may have seen it. I've only gone there a couple times because I think it's like biker chick clothing or something. And I'm not really interested,
There's a pizza place next door.
yeah. But if you go there, I just took this picture yesterday. If you go in there, they restored this building, and it was built in 1880, I should say, and restored in 1914. And if you go in there and you take off this thing, there's the tunnel. Okay? And you can actually go there now at any point and just ask, say, do you have this place with the tunnel thing? And they'll pull it and show you whatever. They don't want to go down there. I don't want to go down. I don't think I'd even fit. But okay, the concept is there. I do know that. And when I was there yesterday, I had this guy came. He went down there for us and take pictures. So he worked there. So this is where what it looks like now, just so you kind of know the concept of it. It's just basically a tunnel. But we do know that there was a place, but it's now blocked off, where it would have gone probably across the street and then probably into the river.
So the fire department made all those tunnels, they shut them all down because the problem was that there was a fire on one side of the block,
It would-
the fire could carry to the other
All
side
the way
of the
through,
block.
yeah.
So they wanted to make sure all of those were closed for that
Yeah.
reason.
So it just makes it an interesting story, though, because there's so much discussion about that there were tunnels that were used during Prohibition. Probably at some point as something, whether they just hid liquor there, but it depends if someone would want to open and seize, so maybe there was a way to go and take it off also. Okay?
The bank downtown had a big safe that went down to limestone, way below everybody else. They had a hard time removing it.
That's the thing that you have to think about in terms of downtown Shakopee, is that the limestone there is really up to the surface. So you have to really dig to get down there in the first place. So it's good that they did it back then in order to have that tunnel, but that's probably why they stayed for such a long time, is because they were limestone, but you can't, stop it. I would also say one just other thing is probably the rats probably enjoyed the tunnels too. They probably still did. And of course you've heard the story about the rats here in Shakopee in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They had such a problem with rats because they were, there's so much food out, and garbage and stuff. And it got so bad that the city said that if you bring a rat dead in, they'll give you 5 cents. And this was during the Depression time for a lot of people. So a lot of kids actually used to go, they had guns, and they would buy the bullets, I suppose. There was a certain cost they do. They'd give you a certain amount, and they'd take those and they'd shoot, and they would get you know, you bring 10 rats in, you'd get 50 cents, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not a good math person. All right, so, and that 50 cents was, when I talked to the older people here, they said it wasn't for them, it was really, they had to give it back to their parents
Sure.
in order to feed them, basically, was what
And
was
buy more
happening.
bullets.
And so what happened, we do know that at one point, that was happening, but finally the people who were working at the city hall said it was too much, they don't want these big rats, dead rats, what am I supposed to do with them, right? And so then they asked, instead they said you have to just bring in the tail. And so they would shoot the rats, cut off the tail, and just bring in the tail. And it actually brought those in, and the same thing would happen, they would get 5 cents. Later, I think it became 10 cents, they told me some later. But that went on for many years, and a lot of people, that's how they made their money. It's also interesting because the kids say, that are older now, but they said they remember that they would wait with all the tails, they would leave them there. The people who were working there were like, ooh, I don't want any more, so they would take the tails and brought it outside to the garbage can and put it in there. And the kids were sitting there watching,
Yes.
and when they went back up, they went back, grabbed those tails, brought them up and got another, got some more money. They said that usually happened, but it's also interesting because they all said they never did it more than one. You know, they went, did it, and then one more time. They didn't keep going over and over and over, but I think if they're really smart, that's what they should have done. But they said that's what they remember doing. So it's just kind of interesting, the history of what it was like. Okay. Now, does anybody else remember anything more about Prohibition here in Shakopee that you've heard?
In your research, did you find much about some dude from Minneapolis called Kid Can?
Oh, sure.
I've heard a little bit about it, but not a lot. Can you tell me a little more about that? I'll find some.
I don't know a lot, but I've heard a lot over the years about Kid Can. I don't know if anybody else knows.
They had,
I heard he was a regular in Shakopee.
Yeah, I know he was a regular, yeah.
but as his residence, he had a way to get to the other people's homes in regards to raids. King Ken had a sister and an aunt, and so they had ways of getting around when trouble came.
Oh, really?
Most of the stuff with Jay's sock fought happened, but this is a residence in St. Louis Park or something.
In St. Louis Park. But in Shakopee?
Yeah, what Jay said, that towns.
I think he came to do the gambling with
Yeah.
Gambling here.
him. He was a notorious gangster.
Yes.
He was part
Yes,
of
it
the,
was.
eventually, I think he had a part in the bus company and the trolley company and some stories there, but,
I'll have to look and try to find out more. If I do, I'll, put it into the newsletter or something, because I'd like to find out more about that. I just didn't like the same, I just heard that he was a gambler who came to Shakopee, but you say there's more than that.
I think there's a lot more, and I know he died in Florida eventually. Or died a natural death or was killed, I don't know. He didn't have a lot of friends.
He didn't have a lot of friends, he said.
Now, I don't know exactly where this happened, but when my husband was a young man and he was doing some construction someplace in Minneapolis, they had to take a wall off. And from ceiling down to the floor, the width of a joist was a copper place where there was liquor for when they served during the Prohibition.
Wow. It is just amazing. It was a long time, and people they wanted their alcohol,
Sure.
right? But I just think it's so interesting, the different strategies people went to.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think it partly was because I think they made some really good money at a time when people were pretty broke. And that's why you even look at the people in Shakopee, a lot of people who did very well, probably in the past, they were probably, someone was with the thing, because that's how they get that. Okay? Yeah.
Okay, because I know my age, and it had to be in the late 40s, I remember going by the rock spring and seeing all those cars and nobody there, and we always wondered, well, where are all the people? All right, and so that was the late 40s, and you said
Yeah.
this happened way before that,
It,
so
it,
it's
you
still
know, it
going
started,
on.
continued on for a
Yeah,
long time.
Yeah. Okay, so it,
Probably the gambling part, but the illegal booze was probably not a portion of it.
Right,
yeah,
once that was
probably,
not-
yeah,
right.
probably, yeah, I know,
Yeah.
but I just so remember that.
But it's interesting that you remember that, but you just don't know what was going on there. but you
No,
never thought-
of course, I have no idea.
Yeah. You say.
Yeah,
How
membership.
was the gambling and the booze terminated in the 40s?
Well, first because it was with the governor first, is that when they forced a new person in to take it down. And that helped, but it didn't necessarily, like I said, in here it said, and this is what I remember, that it was at least another 13 years after Prohibition is ended before they actually got to stop really with gambling machines and stuff.
The story is Pat Thielen, they brought
Pat,
Pat Thielen in
yeah.
as a city chief of police, and he kind of shut it down.
Yeah.
And we have some books, I think it's still,
Yeah.
still Pat
He
Thielen.
talks about it, yeah.
there's-
Yeah, he was kind of there to, he was kind of the guy that brought it to an end, but
To
I'm
do
sure it
it.
took a while.
There was a sheriff that.
Sheriff was taking his cut, yeah,
Yeah,
arrested
yeah.
for him. Yeah.
Well, no, he's the one that get kicked out, isn't it?
Right,
Yeah.
he's the one that got kicked out, yeah. And Thielen's interesting because he actually was, I guess you'd say when he was younger, he was trouble, you know? He was kind of involved with a lot of things, and he was really, like, he was one who, people said, I think someone told me, when he walked down the street, they would go to the other side of the street to walk. Because
He was a prize fighter. He was
Yeah, he was a
He
prize
killed-
fighter.
He killed dogs.
And he killed dogs.
He did,
Mm-hmm.
he killed dogs.
Oh.
My very best friend, she hates him to this day.
Because
He killed her dog.
yeah.
He stole hay.
It's so it's interesting what people remember.
No flowers for him at the graveyard.
But he did,
Yeah,
but in some ways, because once he became mayor, police person, he able to follow up things because he kind of knew those people very well. You know what I mean? So I think that probably helped in many ways. Just makes it interesting.
Yeah.
I'll see you.
Okay? All right, any last questions here? Comments?
Thanks, Dave.
Good job.
Good job.